Good evening and welcome back to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some important international security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Michael Carpenter, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and the Senior Director of the Joe Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled "The Balkans Still Need U.S. Leadership." Since the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, American leadership has remained crucial for ensuring security in the Western Balkans. The recent meeting in the White House between Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and Kosovo Prime Minister Abdullah Hoti demonstrated Washington's commitment to resolving disputes that prevent regional development. Talks between Serbia and Kosovo to normalize their relations have continued sporadically since the Brussels Agreement in 2013, while the EU relaunched negotiations this summer after several years of drift. It is America's involvement that ensures real impetus to a final resolution. The core of the conflict is Belgrade's stubborn refusal to recognize Kosovo as an independent state. Instead of developing productive interstate relations, Serbia's authorities remain stuck in a Yugoslav nostalgia. The White House summit specified various economic areas where the two countries can intensify their cooperation. But the real significance of the meeting was twofold. First, it reaffirmed that American officials are convinced that only mutual recognition between Serbia and Kosovo will normalize relations. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo underscored the U.S. position in a private meeting with Prime Minister Hoti. Serbian officials hoped that the Trump administration would soften its position on Kosovo statehood and objected to the initial draft of the White House text, which stressed the importance of mutual recognition. In a second major step, Washington reiterated its commitment to expanding the number of countries that recognize Kosovo statehood. The announcement in the White House that Israel will recognize Kosovo was a significant breakthrough, especially as Kosovo views itself, similarly to Israel, as a country created in the wake of genocide to defend the Albanian people. The European Union also has a major role to play. Brussels needs to reinforce the principles laid out by Washington that the final status of Kosovo is irreversible and that mutual recognition between Serbia and Kosovo is the only logical solution. Such an achievement would not only normalize political relations, but would also boost economic interactions between the two states. Foreign investment is vital in economic development, but business needs certainty about a stable political climate where all barriers on trade and travel are lifted. Only a symmetrical relationship between two states that recognize each other can generate regional stability and economic progress. American leadership must remain focused on this goal, regardless of which administration holds office after the US elections. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Michael Carpenter, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and the Senior Director of the Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. Thank you for joining me on the show, Mike, after our long summer break.
Well, it's great to be with you, Janusz.
So let me jump straight in on questions about Kosovo's future. How do you interpret the recent Serbia-Kosovo meeting in the White House between Prime Minister Hoti and Serbian President Vučić? Was this some sort of a breakthrough, as some officials have proclaimed, or really more a question of symbolism over substance?
Well, I think this was mostly a photo op that was engineered by the Trump White House in order to boost his reelection in November. There really wasn't a whole lot from the meeting of substance that I think will carry forward. We already know that the quote unquote agreement was really just a bunch of bullet points, in fact, different ones that the two sides signed that were nothing more than a political commitment. Now, that said, I think it's useful to emphasize communications links and economic development. I think that is a useful sort of backup to the political dialogue that's being managed by the EU. So the premise of the meeting, I think, is entirely well-founded. The problem, however, I think, was with the execution. It was a little bit rushed. The U.S. didn't pledge a concrete dollar amount. And already the two sides are walking back some of their commitments because this wasn't a legally binding agreement, as I said, just a series of political commitments. So it certainly is not deserving of the Nobel Prize. I mean, that is farcical that Trump would suggest that yesterday at one of his rallies. But, it's not entirely inappropriate to be pursuing economic links.
Right. I mean, as you said, there was no real joint agreement. In fact, they signed two separate letters of intent, you could call them. Their signatures did not appear on the same document, which does not bode well for future cooperation on that front. But do you think, there was other elements of this which I found even more interesting. For instance, the initial text of the draft of the text contained language about working towards mutual recognition, which Vučić and the Serbian delegation objected to. Don't you think that indicates that Kosovo's final status has been settled, which Belgrade was hoping that there would be some reversal by the Trump administration?
Well, Vučić has said very clearly that he is not in favor of recognizing Kosovo, and the EU membership is not sufficient for him to allow him to take that step. So, despite the posturing from the White House, we're still a long ways away from mutual recognition, which has to be the ultimate basis for any political deal. Nothing short of that is going to move the two sides forward and is going to be acceptable, really, for the EU to go ahead with its membership application from Serbia.
There's one other important element. There was, let's say, one significant element in this. I want to hear what your interpretation is. Recognition by Israel of Kosovo and vice versa. As you know, Kosovo has been fighting for international recognitions as it cannot get membership of the United Nations. They've been doing it bilaterally, a campaign of recognition. Serbia's been doing a campaign of derecognition or preventing recognition. How do you interpret Kosovo-Israel establishing diplomatic relations?
Well, I see it as entirely positive. That's part of this agreement that I wholeheartedly support. Good for Israel to recognize Kosovo, good for Kosovo to recognize Israel. The trick, however, is that it doesn't appear that President Vučić really intends to move forward with his promise to move his embassy to Jerusalem, which he appeared very surprised at the meeting when that part was read to him by President Trump. And so we'll have to see whether that part of this agreement gets carried out. But mutual recognition is good. Again, the bigger picture here, Janusz, is that already the two sides are backing away from their promises from just a couple weeks ago. And so already you have the Serbian side indicating that, well, they are going to seek derecognition potentially, or at least behind the scenes. And the Kosovo side also seems to be saying, well, why should we not pursue recognition for our country? That was, in fact, the basis on which these talks were held. So, I'm very skeptical that this deal will hold together. I hope that the economic aspects of it do hold together, but there just doesn't appear to be enough there to really drive momentum forward. And last thing I want to say about this is, the biggest deficit in this White House stage meeting was the fact that the EU was not really brought in and consulted. And, I know a lot of Kosovars have qualms with the EU for not moving quickly enough with visa-free travel, for the fact that there's the 5 non-recognizers that are sort of sitting on the fence. There's legitimate criticism in Kosovo of the EU. But the U.S. can't hope to move the ball forward by acting as if the EU were some sort of renegade party. They have to lead the EU and work with the EU together to achieve, a mutually beneficial outcome.
I was going to ask you about the EU role in this, because there's a parallel track, if you like, of talks, so-called experts talks between Kosovo and Serbia, facilitated by the European Union. But let me ask you one more question about this White House meeting. That we hear so much about normalizing economic relations, but surely they cannot be normalized unless there are full interstate relations, political relations. I mean, how can you boost foreign investment if there is still insufficient political certainty about the status of one country? And also, to boost trade, countries need to recognize each other's passports, each other's economic documents, and so on and so forth. I mean, don't you think this is a little bit misleading, this economic focus?
Absolutely. And the White House seems to be saying that, well, it has confidence. And when it displays confidence in the two parties, that means that investors will follow. But that's empty talk. Investors want to see concrete normalization agreements put into practice, as you say, so that they know that there is a lasting basis upon which they can do commerce, at least if the commerce is going to flow between the two countries. And so it is a little bit empty. And as I said earlier, I was told in advance of the agreement that there was going to be some sort of US dollar figure attached to this. And of course, there wasn't. So the US promise of economic assistance appears to be pretty hollow. There's not really any pledging conference. There's no real mechanism for putting money into infrastructure in the region that is going to allow businesses to see a perspective for their own investments. And so, just like, a lot of these agreements that were made, or at least a lot of the bullet points that were made in this agreement, were previously agreed by the two parties, but simply never implemented. And I don't know why anyone really thinks that this is suddenly going to lead to their implementation. I don't see it that way. I see it as just another commitment that is going to be predicated ultimately, as you say, on political recognition, because that is really the prerequisite for moving forward with greater economic ties, and not the other way around.
Exactly. Very last question on the talks. How do you see the EU role in this at present? I mean, have they been upstaged? Have they been given a sort of a different agenda? I mean, where do things stand there?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the dueling summits, the virtual summit held between Presidents Macron and Chancellor Merkel on the one hand, and then President Trump's summit, that there was a bit of one-upsmanship here, each side trying to be the first to gather the two leaders together and come up with a process that could then be sustained. And frankly, I think that's unhealthy. This should not be a competition between the EU and the US for glory and for hosting summits. This should be something that the two sides, as I said earlier, coordinate together, because they have the same ultimate objectives, which is mutual recognition and reconciliation and closer economic ties. And of course, the EU is the biggest prize here. They have the most leverage because Serbia wants EU membership, Kosovo wants EU membership as well as NATO membership. And so the EU is a very forceful actor, or at least should be, which is why the US should be working with the EU and not sort of, stiff-arming them and organizing summits without even really briefing their envoys on the contents of what those summits will entail.
Right. Let us turn now, Mike, to Montenegro. Again, very important developments, recent national elections, first time in 30 years that the DPS, the Democratic Party of Socialists, has not been voted in. We have the formation of a new coalition, very broad coalition government. What impact do you think this is likely to have, both domestically and internationally? Let's start with the domestic situation. I mean, do you think that the new government is going to implement some major political changes in the country?
Well, that remains to be seen. It's a very disparate, diverse coalition. In fact, it's a coalition that is formed from three coalitions. And we'll have to see. One of them is fairly pro-Western, pro-European. I'm speaking about URA. The other two have at least one the Democratic Front has financing from Russia and Serbia, and so has a very different geopolitical orientation. So as far as changes internally, frankly, Janusz, I'm very worried about the future of Montenegro. And, I shouldn't be, because after 30 years in power, it should be a welcome development that the ruling party loses an election and that the opposition comes to power. Normally, we would celebrate that as a democratic transition. Huntington's famous, electoral turnover test has been passed. And yet, in this case, because the opposition is financed and directed by pro-Serb and pro-Russian elements, not the entire coalition, but parts of it, I worry. I worry about the future of Montenegrin civil society, because already we see protests now between, on the one hand, sort of, pro-Serb Chetnik organizations and Montenegrin nationalists. And since independence, Montenegro, you can say a lot of things about it, including some negative things, but you have to admit it's a multi-ethnic democracy, and it has been functioning fairly well as such. And that's where I'm worried. I'm worried that the multi-ethnic fabric of Montenegrin society could be torn by this division that's being fueled, in fact, by certain members of the ruling coalition now, between the pro-Russian elements and the pro-Montenegrin elements.
Yeah, you raise a number of very important points there, Mike. I mean, one of the things, for instance, that the Montenegrins fear is that the new government could make it easier for Serbs in Serbia to register as Montenegrins in future elections, or as residents of Montenegro for future elections in the upcoming census. And this could actually change the proportion of Serbs in the country and lead to potentially even more, let's say, acute conflicts between Montenegrins and Serbs, but also with the minority communities, the Albanian and Bosniak communities in particular.
Yeah, and so I agree with you. I agree completely, and I think this is dangerous. Of course, the Serbian Orthodox Church also played a disproportionately large role in this election, and I think that the government made a mistake by fanning sort of the flames of division in terms of passing the law on church properties and antagonizing the Serbian Orthodox Church in a very public, demonstrative way just prior to the election. I'm not sure that was a very good move. But at this point, you do have these cleavages, and you do have, from the Serbian side, not from the church, but from the Serbian government, you do have a concerted effort by some actors to have more influence in Montenegro. And as you say, potentially registration of Serbian citizens who have property in Montenegro or whatnot. And, Serbs have always been present in Montenegro, and the Serbian Orthodox Church has a right to exist there and to have its properties and to worship and so on and so forth. But what we're seeing now are tensions being fueled as a result of this. And, that's kind of the Russian playbook here in America and in so many other countries, is to sort of sow chaos and divisions and try and amplify the divisions, especially when they're ethnic or racial. And that, to me, is very dangerous for the future of Montenegrin democracy.
It's paradoxical because, as you mentioned, what we've encouraged is turnover during elections, turnover of parties, turnover of government, peaceful transfers of power, new coalitions coming in, sort of bringing in larger constituents and new political actors. But in the Montenegrin case, are we substituting what has been considered a sort of cliquish, corrupt, but pro-Western administration with a potentially corrupt pro-Moscow administration, which would be even more dangerous?
Well, absolutely. And elections don't always lead to pro-Western parties coming to power. We saw in Moldova, which is, of course, a different case, but we saw this bizarre coalition forming between the pro-Western opposition party and the pro-Russian Socialist Party in order to oust the oligarchic ruler of Moldova, Vladimir Plahotniuc. That artificial coalition fell apart, and now the pro-Western, pro-Russian camps are fighting each other in the election. But in Montenegro, it's a little bit different, and yet there's some elements of that. Clearly, the opposition wants to de-oligarchize Montenegrin society to sort of reduce the corruption and the influence of organized crime. And that's all good. But outside powers are toying with this dynamic and are trying to influence it for their own purposes. And that's the dangerous part.
Yeah, and also the Democratic Front in the major coalition presumably has been corrupted by Russian money as well.
Well, there's numerous reports that the Democratic Front is being backed by Russian interests, and that is real cause for concern, not to mention the fact that in 2016, people affiliated with the Democratic Front are alleged to have helped to engineer this attempted coup d'etat, which was organized by the GRU. And so, this is really skating on thin ice as far as the future of the country as a democratic society is concerned.
Right. Another major issue, of course, on the international arena is NATO membership. I mean, is that going to be challenged, threatened by this new coalition? Is there going to be some reversals on state sovereignty, independence? And for its immediate neighbor, Kosovo, Montenegro was one of the first countries to recognize Kosovo as an independent state. Is that going to be now challenged by the new government?
Well, you had members of the Democratic Front openly questioning whether it was a smart decision to have recognized Kosovo's independence and suggesting that that could be reversed. Now, the leader of the coalition, Ranko Krivokapić, has said that NATO membership is not in jeopardy, that Montenegro's geopolitical orientation will continue, that Kosovo will not be derecognized. And so there are words of assurance from the top. But as I said earlier, and as you know, Janusz, I mean, it's such a diverse coalition that the fact that Krivokapić says one thing, does not mean that other members of his own coalition are not going to be working actively in an opposite direction.
Right. And one other question.
And, just one more thing, if I could, Janusz, on this, the real sort of kingmaker role here is URA. I mean, they're a small political party led by Abazovic. And, as an ethnic Albanian living in Montenegro, he's going to have to make some very tough decisions about whether to support a coalition that potentially seeks, or at least parts of it, seek derecognition of Kosovo and fan the flames of sort of Serbian nationalism within the country. Is that, a direction that he is comfortable supporting? I think the obvious answer is no, but to what extent is he going to be a part of this coalition, try and give it a chance to actually rule and govern, and when is he going to decide that too much is too much if things get out of hand? That's the open question that I think a lot of people are asking themselves right now.
Right. We're going to be returning to this for quite a while, I think, as the new government takes shape. Let's turn now, Mike, to Serbia. How do you assess Serbia, first of all, domestically under Vučić? I mean, since the last elections, which the opposition boycotted, there is a single-party monopoly in parliament, in government. Very much different, I would say, to Montenegro and Kosovo, which is, coalition building and a very pluralistic system. How do you see Serbian politics developing?
Yeah, I'm afraid Serbian politics are not developing in a very democratic direction for all the reasons you mentioned. I think it was a mistake for the opposition to have boycotted the election, frankly, if I may say so. I realized that the playing field was not level, and there were concerns about that. But by taking themselves out of the game, essentially they have given the ruling party a monopoly, and also they have not sort of fostered a more civil dialogue. So the only mechanism for people to voice their opposition to the government right now is to go out on the street and protest. And that has also stirred up emotions. And there have been, frankly, there have been accusations from the Serbian government that perhaps Russian interests have been involved in also stoking violence to try to undermine the government. And so that's an interesting dynamic, but it's not a healthy one. And so you want to have electoral competition. You want to have civil society when it feels disgruntled, when it feels that the country's moving in the wrong direction, have a political outlet for their sentiments and not have to take to the streets. That is an unhealthy dynamic going forward. And so, I hope that at some point in the future, the opposition sort of gets its act together and decides to compete, and that, frankly, the government does not overly cement its advantage by passing laws and stacking law enforcement in the courts and so on in order to secure that advantage over time.
Right, and on the external dimension, would you see Serbia as a constructive or not a constructive element in the Western Balkans? I mean, some say that it still is pursuing a greater Serbia program, not through war, not through territorial conquest, but through undermining neighboring states, benefiting from Russian assistance, and so on and so forth. We saw this actually direct interference in the Montenegrin elections, whether through the Serbian Orthodox Church, through nationalists. Exactly what role the government was playing in this, we don't fully know. But how do you see the Serbian role in the region?
Well, I don't think the Serbian government is a monolith, and so I think there's a push and pull between various different elements, some of which want to be more supportive, for example, of Dodik and Republika Srpska, some of which want to gain more leverage and control over Montenegrin politics, and want to push back on developments in Kosovo and Albania. And so there's some more destructive elements in the government, but there's also some folks who I think genuinely want to be more cooperative, who see European integration as the future and want to push in that direction, and so are reluctant to get involved in some of these conflicts, want to keep Dodik at arm's length, for example. And so it's a real sort of competition between these camps within the ruling party.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into Bosnia, because that's a subject for another show, I think. I mean, it's a huge topic, particularly with the recent visit of Dodik to Croatia. I think he's first since becoming president. But anyway, let me turn now to the Russian factor in the region, which we've mentioned. It's interesting. Every country we mention, there is a Russian component in this, a Russian element, negative most usually. Can you see the emergence of some sort of common front, interstate front, against Russia's subversion in the region, in areas such as disinformation, corruption, other threats to national or regional security? Is there sufficient, let's say, consensus in the region against Russia?
No, I think clearly not, unfortunately, not at the interstate level. And that's where Russia, it manages to get its way. Whenever there's divisions, it's able to pick states apart and maximize its influence and its leverage individually within particular states wherever it can. And that's what we're seeing. So we have a new government now in North Macedonia. We can talk about that later, but they seem more intent on pushing back on Russian malign influence. Obviously, Kosovo and Albania, for historic reasons, are more immune to that influence, but not entirely immune, and are pushing back. But then in other parts of the region, you see Russian influence on full display. We mentioned Montenegro, but also Republika Srpska. Serbia is an interesting case because clearly there's an enormous amount of Russian influence in Serbia. And yet, as I mentioned, there's some evidence that Russia may have been behind some of the more bloody incidents in terms of the street protests, and that rubbed the government the wrong way. And so there is that tension there. And of course, the Serbs have withdrawn from any military exercises in Belarus that would be lending legitimacy to the Lukashenko government. So, which of course is being backed by Russia. And so, it's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture. But ultimately, the region as a whole is so divided that Russia is able to get its way in many places.
Well, is this an area, Mike, that maybe the next U.S. administration should be focusing on? I mean, if we're serious about curtailing, reducing, eliminating Russia's, let's say, negative and nefarious role throughout Europe, a good place to start would be in the Balkans, where I think we still have a good deal of influence and respect.
Absolutely. But what's needed is to have the U.S. and the EU working together to minimize Russian influence. And of course, it's hard. It's not something that can be accomplished overnight because Russia does have enormous influence in Banja Luka. It has a lot of influence in Belgrade, and that will continue no matter what we do. But we can work with the governments in the region to help minimize it and to put alternative things on the table that will increase our own influence and leverage with the governments in the region. And that's what's important. And it really should be something that is done in concert with the EU and not with U.S. envoys sort of running around doing their own thing. Sure, the U.S. needs to pay more attention to the Western Balkans. It needs to have that sort of senior diplomatic presence there in order to achieve results. But it's not just enough to do that. It has to be really sort of taking aside our European partners at the head of state level and really coming up with not just a strategic vision for the future, because I think we have that already. It's sort of Europe whole, free, and at peace, but a much more granular understanding of how we're going to achieve that. You know, what are the non-recognizers thinking in terms of strategic impact? Like, why in 2020 would it make sense for a Slovakia not to recognize Kosovo? Those sorts of questions need to be put on the table, and we need to have a common vision for how to move the region forward.
Yeah, very good points about the non-recognizers. One quick question about Macedonia. How do you see the new coalition government, which again includes several Albanian ministers?
Well, I'm optimistic because North Macedonia shows what happens when you have multi-ethnic cooperation between Albanian parties and the SDSM. It's got a pro-Western orientation. It is committed to European integration, which of course is the next big hurdle that the country faces, having achieved NATO membership. And the relationship with Greece is on a really solid footing. And that's excellent because Greece is, of course, a major player in the Western Balkans. And so I'm very bullish about North Macedonia. I see the country, you know, potentially, if they roll up their sleeves and tackle some of the tough reforms, really moving rapidly towards EU membership. And I just hope that the EU recognizes that it has to reciprocate, that, you know, look at what happened with Macedonia for all those years where it was kept at arm's length from NATO because of Greece's veto. You know, corruption, stagnation, regression, that's what happened. And so I hope the EU is a little bit more smarter strategically and realizes that by giving North Macedonians concrete fruits for tough reforms, concrete benefits for rolling up their sleeves, that the people will see that there is traction and they will get behind reforms and support EU membership and hopefully achieve it.
Right. Let's turn now, Mike, to U.S. policy. Basically, how do you see the difference between a Trump policy, particularly towards the Balkans, but maybe look at wider Europe as well, and what we could expect from a Biden presidency? I mean, Joe Biden has long-term connections with the region, dating back to the wars in the 1990s when he chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I remember testifying in front of the region on several occasions. He has long-term connections and knows the region very well. What differences do you expect if there is a Biden presidency?
So you've got two diametrically opposed visions for international relations from President Trump and Vice President Biden. President Trump's vision of international relations is to promote nationalist populism. He is himself a nationalist populist leader. He does not believe in supranational institutions like the European Union, which he has called one of America's greatest foes. He's waged a debilitating trade war against the EU. He wants to tear, in the words of his own EU ambassador, Gordon Sondland, he wants to tear the EU apart. And so that is just very discordant with the aims of so many countries in the Western Balkans who aspire to EU membership. And yet here you have a U.S. president who sees the EU as the bane of nationalist populist governments. And so you've got folks like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban endorsing Trump. Why? Because their visions are harmonious. So Trump stands with folks like Orban and Putin, and he very much stands with Putin and Russian influence and cannot bring himself to say, one negative thing about Putin. He was asked about the poisoning of Navalny, and he stammered and stuttered and punted the question. This is someone who is clearly in the Kremlin's pocket for whatever reason. And then you have an alternate vision, which is one of strengthening alliances and partnerships. I think that is the essence of a Biden foreign policy, and working with our allies and partners to reduce the scope for Russian malign influence, for achieving Euro-Atlantic integration, and for really trying to lock the countries of the region that are adrift into putting them on a more stable footing, locking them into the institutions of the EU and NATO, so that together we can tackle the challenges of this century, which are not necessarily just Russia, but also Chinese economic influence, Iranian malign influence, and then a whole panoply of other things like climate change and transnational corruption, organized crime, etc. So, your vision is either America acts alone. We don't need alliances. The EU is an artificial abomination. Or we need to work with our allies and partners because we need to strengthen the community of like-minded democracies so that we can tackle challenges together. Those are two diametrically opposed visions. They couldn't be any different. And so, that's what I think the two leaders represent for the region.
What about NATO? Would we expect a different approach from Biden vis-a-vis the alliance, the North Atlantic Alliance?
Oh, well, again, you couldn't possibly imagine two different approaches. Trump, who calls NATO obsolete, who came this close, a hair's breadth from withdrawing the United States from the NATO alliance. I mean, he went so far as to ask John Bolton to look into it, how it could be achieved. And Bolton writes about this in his book. And, he sees everyone who participates in NATO as a sucker. And mark my words, if Trump were to win a second term, he would withdraw the U.S. from NATO. Maybe not formally, but he would pull the U.S. out of NATO activities in a way that destroys the alliance. He's already questioned whether the U.S. would come to the defense of Montenegro, calling Montenegrins aggressive people. He said that he questions whether the U.S. would defend, quote unquote, delinquent allies. So he has shredded the credibility of Article 5 already. And, contrast that with Joe Biden's approach, which is that NATO is, the greatest military alliance in history and needs to be strengthened. It needs to have an open door to all democratic countries that meet the criteria for membership. And it needs to adapt itself continuously to the challenges that its members face moving forward, which includes Russian aggression, certainly, which remains very much on the table, as we've discussed, but also Chinese economic influence and subversive influence. And so, NATO may not be the answer to every question that's out there, certainly not when you're thinking about things like pandemic disease, but it is a cornerstone on which to build our partnerships and relationships across Europe. And so a Biden administration, I'm convinced, will invest a great deal of energy, resources, and diplomatic capital into strengthening the alliance and really putting it on a solid foundation, as opposed to Trump, which is the opposite.
Would a Biden presidency reverse his troop withdrawal proposal by Trump? Withdrawing however many 20,000, I think it is, U.S. troops from Germany, potentially also withdrawing troops from Kosovo.
Yeah, look, I don't want to comment, Janusz, on what a Biden presidency might do because it's not my place. You could ask the campaign. I'm fairly confident in saying that I think a Biden administration would probably do a review of our global force posture and certainly look at some of the decisions that this administration, the Trump administration, has made and possibly revise them. But I can't speak to the outcome because that would be getting ahead of myself. And they have to speak for themselves. But I think the approach, as I said, would be radically different. I mean, why would you withdraw U.S. troops from Germany, which is the largest NATO country, both in terms of size of population and in terms of its military and its economic might? Why would you antagonize a central player in the NATO alliance by withdrawing troops, even if it is to put some of them into other countries. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Mike, let me turn to one other a burning issue, which it's sort of smoldering at the moment, but it could flare up again, and that's Belarus. There's been an ongoing national upheaval against a clearly forged election by President Lukashenko. The question I want to ask you is, where does Russia fit in this? I mean, will the Kremlin prop up Lukashenko's now been, I think, publicly has been completely discredited as a dictator, or will they try to forge some sort of post-Lukashenko government which would enable them to more closely absorb the country politically, economically, militarily? How do you see that evolving?
Well, we have already seen, Janusz, that the Kremlin has deployed plane loads upon plane loads of FSB advisors, media consultants, security analysts, and other political technologists, as the Russians like to call them, to advise Lukashenko on how to crack down on the protest movement, how to decapitate it by arresting its leaders and putting them out of commission, and how to cling to power. At the same time, these very same folks that Moscow is sending to Minsk are taking control of various institutions, particularly the power ministries like the BKGB, the Ministry of Interior, and the Armed Forces. So my bet is that the Kremlin will support Lukashenko thoroughly in the near term, but will then try to engineer some sort of faux transition to another leader who is pro-Kremlin. And so that's going to take some time. So they're going to have to vet a slate of pro-Kremlin candidates to be able to field in a subsequent election. There's already been talk, very coordinated talk, if you'll notice, between Moscow and Minsk, speaking about the need for constitutional changes that would presumably give more power to the parliament, but in reality would likely give an opportunity for pro-Kremlin puppet parties to be established and to gain some control, so that if there is another leader who follows Lukashenko, who is more independent than Lukashenko has been, that the Kremlin would have another way of controlling that leader. And so you already see both Lukashenko and Putin talking about the need for dialogue, but not dialogue with the street protests, not dialogue with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, not dialogue with the National Coordinating Council, dialogue with some artificially chosen group of representatives of Belarusian society who, by the way, happen to be pro-Kremlin. So I think that's I think Moscow is very carefully and methodically setting the predicate for being able to engineer transition, but not in the near term. In the near term, they're going to prop up Lukashenko and help him to repress this incredible national awakening that has flowered before our eyes.
Well, it's quite remarkable because there used to be just two factors we'd be looking at: the governments in Minsk and the government in Moscow. Now there's a third factor, which is the awakened public, the awakened nation in Belarus. Are they going to tolerate some sort of as you say, Russian-engineered transition, which doesn't really afford them any more political freedoms, doesn't give them any hope of eventually joining the European Union, or at least moving closer to the European Union? Is it going to replicate the same sort of dictatorship, maybe in a slightly milder form? You know, we don't know actually also to what degree Belarusian society is going to be radicalized as a result of the violence that we see every day perpetrated against peaceful protesters. We have this image that these are very passive, peaceful people, but there comes a time when there's a breaking point.
Yeah, well, it's very hard to predict what direction this protest movement takes. But if you could draw an analogy, perhaps with the Polish Solidarity movement, which was born 40 years ago in the shipyards of Gdańsk, and there you too also had this movement that united workers and intelligentsia, rural and urban, secular and religious members of society, and as part of this national awakening against the communist dictatorial regime at the time. It was repressed in December of '81 by General Jaruzelski and survived underground for 8.5 years until it rose up again and essentially precipitated the fall of communism across the Soviet bloc. So I don't know what form this protest movement is going to take, but I can tell you one thing: Lukashenko will never, ever regain his legitimacy. It is shot. The images of the Omon police brutally beating, even pregnant women is just appalling. And he will never recover from that. And he is 100% responsible for it. But it's hard to know, how a transition could possibly take place that is peaceful and that sees a real, genuine democratic leader come to power, given that the Kremlin is operating behind the scenes, as I've laid out. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. What I wish would happen, Janusz, though, is that Western governments would show a little bit more backbone and would more actively support both Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya and the protest movement itself, but also by putting in place resources to help it. Putting on the table a vision for economic reconstruction of Belarus without Russia.
Well, actually, the Poles have. They've proposed a Marshall Plan for Belarus with the EU.
Right, but the EU has not yet agreed to it. So the Poles have proposed it, but it's not real until the EU signs off. So that's what I'm saying, is that we need the US and the EU and other countries to step up and show, here's what this is going to look like if there is a democratic transition. We're not going to leave you by yourselves at the mercies of, Russian oil exports, which surely Putin will jack up the price of. And so, just getting more involved is what's really called for at the moment, and not sitting on the fence.
Right. Again, a subject we'll be coming back to many occasions, I'm sure, because this is a longer-term revolution, I think, we're witnessing in Belarus. Let me turn to U.S. elections. We're only a few weeks away, and particularly the foreign policy side. Maybe explain to our viewers the importance or lack of importance of foreign policy in the 2020 campaign, although it's connected with different elements of the election, not only Russian interference, but Russian connections, as you mentioned earlier. It's usually not a priority, even though the world is, of course, increasingly interconnected. Economics, information, climate, and, of course, the pandemic connects us now more than ever. To what degree is foreign policy an issue in the campaign?
Well, Janusz, traditionally, American presidential campaigns have not been about foreign policy. And I think that's the case this time as well. Obviously, it plays a role, but we're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic that has killed 200,000 Americans. We have the most cases and the most deaths of any country in the world. And so that is obviously preoccupying a lot of people, and rightly so. And then we have the twin of that pandemic, which is the economic recession that is hitting the United States. And so we have massive job losses at the same time as people are worried about their health. And as this president is threatening to tear down the healthcare system that was passed under Obamacare, which is providing a modicum of health insurance to any American who wants it. And so that series of issues, that complex of issues, is really, I think, consuming just about everybody's attention. And then sort of right behind that is, questions of race and some of the protests that we've seen in this country over the summer, actually longer than just the summer. There's a lot of white nationalists out there now who feel empowered by Trump and what he represents. And so that whole set of issues is also very salient in this election. Joe Biden is running to restore the soul of the nation. Trump is flirting with these white nationalists and sometimes even neo-Nazi groups. It's really disgusting. But that consumes most of the political bandwidth. Foreign policy is important, but not nearly as important as those issues I mentioned. And to give you an example of that, I would just mention the fact that, it was revealed in a bipartisan Senate report, a really shocking thing, that Trump's campaign manager in 2016, Paul Manafort, was business partners with an individual named Konstantin Kilimnik, who has been proven now to be a Russian spy. So you had essentially a Russian mole inside the Trump campaign in 2016 who was being fed proprietary polling data and information on the campaign's activities in swing states, presumably so the Russians could micro-target their disinformation. One doesn't know because this hasn't been thoroughly investigated. But this bombshell news has sort of passed by in America almost as if it were nothing. A lot of people say, well, that's old news. We knew that he had some sort of ties to Russian intelligence. But the gravity of of the facts that are there is so enormous, and yet it does not quite resonate the way that these domestic issues do. So I give that example because foreign policy is clearly important, and yet not as important as some of these other issues.
Right. Very last question, Mike, because I see our time is short. How important are the East European or let's say specifically Balkan diasporas in America in terms of elections? I mean, do they make a difference in some of the most contested swing states, for example, in the Midwest?
Yes, very much so.
Wisconsin, yeah.
Bosniak Americans, Albanian Americans, these Western Balkan diasporas tend to be concentrated in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, to a certain degree, Wisconsin. And these, of course, are the crucial swing states. They're the states that decided the race between Clinton and Trump in 2016 in favor of Trump, and they will determine this race in 2020 as well. So the Western Balkans diasporas are incredibly influential in the 2020 presidential campaign.
So you'd encourage everybody to vote, I presume?
Please register, vote early if you can. Those who are listening in the United States, we've done a lot of outreach to these diasporas, and I think it's just crucial that they have a say and speak their mind because so much is at stake, as we've discussed.
My sense, again, I don't know who's going to ultimately win. My sense is that the preferences are pretty much set in stone. Maybe there's a few independents, a few people that still haven't made up their mind. But I think most people know who they're going to vote for. I think the key question is turnout. How many people are actually going to go and be able to vote and make sure they vote on time?
I agree with you. I think turnout is going to be crucial. And because we're operating in a pandemic, it's an unprecedented situation, and Trump has already cast aspersions on the whole mail-in voting system, suggesting that it's somehow corrupt when there's no signs at all that is the case. And so that element of how many people turn out to vote and how many people mail in their ballots is going to be absolutely crucial. So the more people can make a plan to vote early, to get their mail-in ballot, send it in, make sure it arrives on time, the more important, the more likely their votes are to be counted and to make a difference.
Okay. On that note, Mike, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure we're going to have you back pretty soon. I mean, elections are only a few weeks away now, so maybe after the elections we'll see who wins, and we'll get your assessment of what comes next, how the new administration is going to look. Again, thanks so much. Unfortunately, everybody, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you, with my colleagues, Via Wayne and RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and please remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miropavshim.